Good afternoon. I am so pleased to step back onto the stage to introduce our next panel, Health and Incarceration. This panel, I believe, features two more MacArthur geniuses, so I'm feeling a little set upon by them this afternoon. I was fortunate to hear a version of this panel over a year ago while visiting my alma mater. I walked away with the hope and intention of bringing the panel here to you today, a hope that, with the assistance of our panel moderator, Professor Judith Resnick of Yale Law School, and my fellow panel planning committee members, Judge Adrienne Nelson, Chris Karuba-Katz, and Susan Wilk, has been realized. The panel illustrated for me a fundamental truth, that we are all interconnected. When we think of the physical and mental health impacts of incarceration upon those who we sentence to terms of imprisonment, we must also think of the impacts upon prison staff, upon the families of those who are incarcerated and the families of those who work in carceral settings, upon communities, upon our larger society, and upon ourselves. In her forthcoming book, Impermissible Punishments: How Prison Became a Problem for Democracy, Professor Resnick, a true thought leader on this subject, writes of this interdependency. She posits that governments committed to equality cannot set out to ruin people through incarceration. It is thus incumbent that we all be aware of what people experience, both physically and mentally, when we sentence them to time behind bars, a topic our panelists will help us explore today. We will have some time for Q&A at the end of this panel. There are question cards on each of the tables. If you have a question for the panelists, please write it down and raise your hand so that staff can collect the cards. And with that, I turn it over to you, Judith, and thank you.
Thanks. Hi, can you hear all right? Is this okay? I have to stand on tiptoe. Not quite a podium that goes up and down, so I will instead. So we just heard from Brian Stevenson the importance of being proximate. And we will spend the next 90 minutes being proximate in the sense of having a way through the panelists to understand something about the ways in which prison affects human beings inside and out. The Ninth Circuit's actually been a leader in this topic. I've attended 2 conferences on the relationship between courts and corrections before COVID, convened by the Ninth Circuit. And special thanks, of course, to the Chief Judge and to the wonderful committee that was quite, courts used to be hands-off when it comes to prisons. These people are hands-on, and it was great in co-planning together with the committee members, including Judges Thomas and Nelson and Probation Chief, I'm going to mispronounce, Karuba-Katz, and others who were very much helping us shape the way we will proceed. Let me cut to the chase and then I'll unpack a little bit. First of all, prison is in no way a natural artifact of human beings. We made it up. It's man-made. And for 300 years, people have poured thought and energy into figuring out a thing and calling it prison. Second, the point of prison is to affect body, mind, and in some eras, soul, as energetically as possible. Third, it works in the sense that it does affect body, mind, and all of people's feelings. And the people it affects are not only the individuals who are in detention, but the staff that come in and out, and the communities and the body politic of which it is. And last point to preview, we made it, we can change it. There's nothing natural about the thing we call incarceration. So to just unpack a little and preview the discussion, I wanted to provide a few images. Prison is health is the topic. Health means everything to do with prison because it's an incredibly viscerally engaging sensorial space for anybody who's been in it a little bit and or a lot. Whether there's light, sound, ease of sleeping or not, heat, air, ventilation, food, work, forms of discipline, sensory at its core. And it is continuous with the experiences of the community and then discontinuous. There's a conceit that it's separate, and frankly, there's the terminology of reentry that I push back at. We're all always there in both places. We're all contributors to it, and we're all deeply affected by it. The idea that prison has something to do with health is at the get-go because the conception several hundred years ago and to some extent into the 20th century is that crime is a disease to be cured. So health walks into prison as part of the cure at the beginning, and indeed on both sides of the Atlantic when people were promoting indeterminate sentences at the early part of the 20th century, they were pushing it to say so prison people can figure out who's been cured and therefore eligible to leave. So health as cure for disease, health as actually an artifact of the medical profession, even before there was something called the medical profession, were wired to the construction of the institution of the prison. If you read the contract that Jeremy Bentham drafted for the Panopticon, his famous but not built prison, he talks about there needing to be medical officers because the people who were in detention were supposed to be fed, clothed, and given health care, in part so they could work, so it wouldn't cost anything, good utilitarian that he was. Prison, therefore, as the cure, prison also, though, as source of injury. So from the beginning of prisons, it was also clear that prisons made people sick and ill. And if there's an image I hope will appear on the screen, this is an early painting by a 1780s image by an English painter depicting John Howard, who founded something, who was a prison reformer. He was an early sociologist. He went with measuring tape in hand and documented the horrific conditions in English prisons and then drafted legislation. He wanted to have them be clean, and then he also wanted hard labor, menial work, and terrible food because redemptive suffering was the idea of what you did when you treated prisoners. He was a sociologist in those terms because the people inventing a profession called correction were building on a new tradition of social science at the time. And let's see if we move. There you go. And moving to this tradition of the science of punishment, just get docs, meds, professions, front and center. It wasn't just mere philanthropy, but the dignity of a social science that was constructing something called the thing we call prison. And to do so, pouring thought in, they invented something called the National Corrections Congresses, and then the National Prison Association in the United States, ending up with the American Correctional Association today, and a transatlantic organization called the International Penal Penitentiary Commission, all developing principles for how to treat prisoners, all calling for adequate food, religion, and work, and the like, and then debating what was legitimate or not. And amidst the debate, and this is the first of many warnings that you'll see disquieting images, were, here comes from Harper's, discipline in prison. Discipline as an order, discipline as routine, and discipline as enforcing the rules. Discipline at Sing Sing, here's a dark-skinned man having water torture. There, discipline in prison, a public outcry in the 1860s. To think about the harms of prison as a US artifact is to miss this transnational. I'm now in England in 1902. This is called the treadmill. Men endlessly hitting 7 steps as a form of discipline and punishment. But after World War I, a really interesting pioneering group of feminists in England, in part because women suffragettes had been imprisoned, were seeking reform. England whipped people, flogging, birching. They didn't want corporal punishment, and they wrote right after World War I, They imagined an elaboration of a charter of prisoners' rights, international adoption, forbidding torture, corporal punishment of any kind that would leave permanent marks. The idea of creating international standards is born with them, and these sophisticated political actors convinced the League of Nations to be interested, which in turn convinced this international prison organization of men running prisons to draft minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners that were promulgated in 1934 by the League of Nations, calling, in the words of humanitarianism, for food, medical care, and the like. But no words rights and no words dignity. And indeed, these minimum rules licensed whipping, dark rooms, corporal punishment, and where and how, bring in the lawyers and bring in the docs, as long as it's prescribed by law and in accordance with the decisions of the medical officer. And the next slide, this is the frontispiece, Her Majesty. In 1936, these rules are being disseminated around the world in the hopes. But pause and think of the horrific times, which we heard echoes of from Brian Stevenson earlier. Hitler rises to power in 1933. These rules come out in 34. 1935, this international prison organization meets in Berlin, welcomed by Nazis who tell you a great way to punish crime is sterilization and more, as you all know. And that's in the care of the community. Post-World War II, the transnational revulsion at Holocaust and plantation and the civil rights movement in the United States propelled a different understanding. And for the first time, the idea of rights and dignity made it into the language of the UN's 1955 Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners. And fresh from the concentration camps, the rules about don't parade people, let me underscore that at this moment, don't parade people, no degradation, no exacerbation of suffering, no discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, identities, or the like, to commitment. Fresh air, fresh light, a whole bunch of things, psychiatric services, but still also, in terms of punishment, these rules, not on your screen at the moment, there's a lot of them, licensed solitary confinement and food deprivation, again bring in the docs, as long as a medical officer determines a person is fit to sustain those punishments, and you're supposed to be visited daily, and terminate some of this starvation and isolation if a doctor tells you that it's a problem for physical and mental health. Fast forward to now, and in 2015, with the help of Rick Ramish, who's sitting here and I'll introduce in a minute, a lawyer and then the director of the Colorado prison system, the rules are revised, and what are called now the Nelson Mandela rules now call renew commitment to dignity and rights. Safety is redefined. Safety not just in safety community and minimum food, but care, cleanliness, activity, no food deprivation, no more than 15 days in isolation. Prolonged solitary confinement becomes torture. So far I've put on the screen the social scientists, the lawyers, the docs, the professionals who've invented this institution called prisons. And I haven't put the judges, and I haven't put the people in detention in, because those people in detention, active, articulate, and engaged, knocked at courthouse doors up until the 1960s in the United States and were turned away as hands off. And it was only at the behest of those people that judges got involved. And here, let me introduce you to one, if I can turn the thing again. Here, Winston Talley, handwritten, self-represented, Arkansas, 1965, stopped the whip, WHIPP, a writ of prohibition. He's, as far as I can tell from all the records, an ordinary person for a low-level crime. White men and black men are whipped mercilessly in the Arkansas prisons so that they make their quotas, because there's no budget for the prisons, and it's sell the produce to fund the system. He knocks on a federal court door. A federal district court judge pioneers by appointing him world-class Arkansas chief, the heads of the bars of Arkansas, to represent him in court. Says, yes, you can get into court. Big victory, Section 1983, but no, we won't order the stopping of the whip, because we defer to prison officials and as long as they don't do it arbitrarily and not for more than 10 lashes at a time. Go back, keep coming forward, go other prisoners knocking at the federal courthouse door in Arkansas in the wake of horrific exposés of violence and sadism at the prison. And 2 more judges have a 3-day trial in 1967. Thank you, the National Archives. There's a 640-page transcript we can all read. And the judges say again, you can whip as long as it's not arbitrary. And then, in 1968, Judge Harry Blackmun, before he becomes Justice Harry Blackmun, says the use of the whip, irrespective, is unconstitutional. In a long opinion that tries to still preserve a significant aegis of authority for people who run the prison. Within 2 years, Arkansas is at the very front end of the first conditions case. Holt v. Sarver says that the conditions across the system make the system a dark and evil world, unconstitutional. And 1978 is the U.S. Supreme Court, Hutto v. Finney, in this line of cases. An affirmative obligation to health care is described by the U.S. Supreme Court, again pushing forward, in a case called Estelle v. Gamble, where J.W. Gamble was put in solitary confinement when he complained too much for the injury from his bale of hay. The Fifth Circuit said you've got 1 doctor for 17,000 people as prisoners, and we have here the Supreme Court saying evolving standards of decency requires dignity, requires an affirmative action for health care. I need to add, because we live in a world where there's interest in originalism, what people thought in the 1780s, 1790s, a revolution in punishment practices underway, and the major theorists, Beccaria and Bentham, are all for changing the modes of punishment. So in addition to dynamism in the second part of the 20th century, there was dynamism at the get-go. And the healthcare profession was part of pushing. I'm going to close the imagery with the Ninth Circuit, because Brown v. Plata, these are the 2 pictures that Justice Kennedy adds to his opinion. In 2011, in this circuit, we know that the lack of health care in California enables the Supreme Court, 5-4, to affirm an obligation to provide safety and health care for the people in California's prison. And we know also that there's a lively debate about the relationship between the Constitution and prisoners. And we need to credit the people who are incarcerated with offering a new theory of punishment, that whatever the sovereign can do to the duly convicted, you can't punish me like that, whether it's whipping or solitary or other forms. Constraints on it, even though it's hard and at some level annoying to have to give people what, when you're mad at them and punishing them, but as Jeremy Bentham pointed out in the 1700s, you've taken away everything, you have to keep them safe, otherwise you're violating the rights and the laws under which you live. This is one way to introduce what you're going to learn a lot more about from people who have extraordinary experience in this area, and I'm going to just sequentially introduce them quickly by explaining the composition that we pulled together. Professor Andrea Armstrong, who, the MacArthur's a genius grant, I think we could call it a generativity grant, because she has generated a unique database giving us an insight into the insides of Louisiana's detention and the country's detention in terms of the causes of the lack of health and the deaths that occur. And she will launch us, and we'll turn from her overview to Eravisto Sala, who will explain his experience inside, wrongfully convicted at age 15, per Brian Stevenson, tried as an adult, and left for 27 years till the Innocence Project made clear the perjured testimony that had kept him wrongfully incarcerated. He's experienced firsthand the injuries of incarceration. We will then turn to Rick Ramish, who was the director of Colorado and of Wisconsin's prisons. He's an expert now working at a group called FACCON, and he's the chief expert, according to the reports from Massachusetts and Connecticut, in which systems ask for his advice to how to think about the detention. All of you could read, he had an op-ed where he locked himself in when he was head of the system into Colorado to understand what it felt like to be in solitary confinement for a day. And then we will turn to Dr. Emily Wang, who's another MacArthur Generativity recipient, who's part of a national network of healthcare providers who look at the problems from people transitioning from inside and outside, and she's a hands-on clinician. Dr. Bree Williams, who was supposed to join us, isn't here, and I just want to add one line on her behalf, which is the AMEND project out of the University of California, San Francisco, looks at how bad prison is for the health of people who work there, who on one study have 14 years less of life because they work in prison as they come and go. Blood pressure, mental health, health harms of various kinds. So then the bottom line is, at the end, the question, back to Brian Stevenson and more, is what can we do to make change? And the reason to take you back 300 years is don't rest on the idea that what is has to be, because it's really changed. And some things that people tolerated, from whipping and other forms of torture, are actually ruled out. So the question, of course, is what you can rule out now. And the judges in the room have the question, when they sentence, when they're in supervised release, when they're looking at people at the front end, ex ante and ex post, what can I do to take into account the harm that incarceration imposes on all of us? Professor Armstrong.
Thank y'all. We could try that again. So this happened earlier, and I was the only person who yelled back, "Good afternoon." And I felt incredibly seen as a Southern girl born and raised. So, good afternoon. Good afternoon. See, we learn. We learn and evolve, which I think is a theme for today. So, I am really grateful to be here. I am thankful to our planning committee, which this has been a year almost in the making, and incredible attention and thoughtfulness from y'all, Judge Nelson, Judge Thomas, Chris, and Susan. I just really grateful that y'all were willing to share this information today with this. My goal is really to unpack what punishments can look like from a health perspective in a prison or a jail or a detention center. And because of that, I'm going to be showing a couple of videos, a couple of pictures. And the point is that I want you to be able to see so that you can understand how these different systems reinforce one another. I also want to just warn you that I will be showing videos, and some of it is somewhat disturbing. They are. I mean, there's just no way to get around that. But I do think it's critically important to see, because as Brian Stevenson just reminded us, these are our institutions. They are run in our name with our tax dollars. And so we should also know what is being done in our name. So the first, this is a part of the solitary wing.
In the house of detention on the second floor.
The audio is a little hard to hear, but this is literally a cell on the second floor of a jail. I was walking the jail with a friend of mine, Kiana Calloway. We were documenting it, and he said, "This isn't where they held me. I know where I was held." And it turns out that he was held on this hidden wing of the second floor in these incredibly small rooms. And it reminds me of how unique these spaces are. These spaces, the closest legal analog that I can think of is a military base. And that's because government authority is at its highest ebb in these spaces. And individual rights, those protected by the Constitution, are at their lowest ebb. And it is in this space where visibility matters the most. We think about these spaces as well because of the enormous impact that they have. And it's not just the people behind bars. As Professor Resnick reminded us, staff are doing 12-hour shifts in these same conditions, but also every single person who is behind bars belongs to somebody. Somebody loves that. And because of that, we also need to be present in these spaces with them. As judges, there are also you are in a very unique position of both sentencing, which means after a conviction, sending a person behind bars, but also to protecting those rights through 1983 civil litigation. And so I hope that we can learn more about conditions to keep that in mind. I want to turn to a project that I've worked on, with Daryl Johnson. And Daryl, as he'll tell us in this interview, had a serious lung condition, and this is one of the interviews closest to the end of his life.
My name is Daryl Johnson. I was born at Beecham Hospital in Magnolia, Mississippi. I'm 56 years old. To the tag plant, I got to take physical. Keep in mind that they didn't discover my lungs to have a problem. So when I go over there, man, over the tag plant, I see in your medical file that you have a lung condition now. You can't work over here. I said, I'm gonna move you. I said, cool. And he said, man, he said, I'm the boss over here. And they won't let me fire you and transfer you to another place. He said, you can't hang out here with that mental spirit. It's chemical. It's all in the air. I had too many irons in the fire. I couldn't allow myself to get locked up at that time, because I had got in school, was trying to get my GED. I was working in a tag plant 7 months. It was that damn minister at the tag plant. I shouldn't have been over there. They make the tags for the whole state. They even make special tags, like for LSU. They wanted me dead. That's why they put me in the tag plant. I was in Ward 2, a locked room on Ward 2, locked away for the last 3 years in the hospital. Confined, in solitary confinement. However, I come out of prison with a lung disease. The doctors don't expect me to live very long. They have been telling me that 6 months. But I'm still alive, still pushing, still breathing.
So this is Daryl's exit from the prison on compassionate release. And the things that he told us about were about forced labor, involuntary labor. He talked to us about health care that didn't recognize and treat his lung disease. He talked about solitary confinement, living alone for 3 years without the ability to come and go, even within the prison setting. And he also tells us something about death. And so we're gonna let Daryl Johnson's story shape how we understand punishment today. So incarcerated labor is everywhere. It is everywhere. They run essential operations, kitchens, janitorial, grounds. They do disaster management and recovery, right? Sandbagging in the South. They were part of the BP oil spill. Operating large farms, herd cattling, services for government buildings. So if you ever visit our Louisiana legislature and you go to the cafeteria, the person serving you your food and cooking your food is serving a sentence of conviction. And manufacturing plants, like the license plate factory that he talked to us about. But these are also spaces that are unprotected by law, often through interpretation by judges. It's also important to remember that they don't get normal wages or even Fair Labor Standards Act wages under interpretations of what constitutes an employee. So they may never earn enough within this labor to cover the costs that they face. So a medical fee is deducted $3 from their account for every sick call. But when you earn 2 cents an hour in the field, that $3 becomes $543.75 per sick call visit. That is the equivalent. So people earn pennies on the dollar. And that also doesn't help them to maintain their own health, because this is the food that they eat. 70 cents for a ramen cup is approximately $126. We also know that the food that you might eat while in prison can actually make you sick as well. In an incredible study by the CDC from 1998 to 2014, what they found is if you are behind bars, you are 6.4 times more likely to suffer a food-related illness. And yet these are facilities that are completely operated by the government. That leads to challenges for the health care that someone will get. We know that at its core, carceral health care is a sick call system. It addresses symptoms of sickness, but not necessarily health. In Louisiana, you can get something that's called an old man physical. And the first time I heard that phrase, I was like, well, what's an old man physical? You only get an annual physical when you are 50 years or older when you're in a Louisiana prison by state policy. And that does not align with what we know we need to do on the outside. So for example, colonoscopies are supposed to be started at age 45, right? So a lot of the preventative aspects that we enjoy out here are not part of the healthcare that's delivered behind bars. That healthcare is increasingly treating an elderly population, because as our sentences extend, so too do the number of people who are still within that prison for longer and longer terms. So for example, only over 20% of the BOP prison population is now above 50 years old. And what some studies have showed is that facilities that have higher percentages of elderly populations are spending 5 times the amount as other facilities to provide health care. That health care is also not regulated by Medicaid, which is how unlicensed and unsupervised medical professionals can treat people behind bars. At one point in federal litigation in Louisiana, the evidence, which was stipulated by all parties, was that 7 out of 8 of the medical doctors had temporary or suspended licenses due to disciplinary misconduct. And Medicaid, because it's not involved, right, in the care that is delivered behind bars, also means that so many of the rules that are developed by the Centers of Medicaid and Medicare don't apply. So this is a video. Again, the sound is less important, but the idea is this is a restraint cell on the psychiatric here in the House of Detention.
CLU, North Side, first cell in, restraint cell.
So I want you to notice there's no water or access to a restroom in that open cell that contains the permanent bed. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid have rules about how long therapeutic restraints can be used on an individual, but remember, those rules don't apply. And so for this restraint bed, the practice was to have both ankles cuffed, both wrists cuffed, and then a chest chain. And it is on a bed similar to this that Kane Maselli died in 2009. She had spent 4 hours in 5-point restraints at the city's jail. She complained repeatedly that she couldn't breathe. In fact, her purse, which was located in the property room, had her asthma medication in it. And if she hadn't died on a bed just like that, she would have remained restrained on that bed for an additional 9 hours under the orders that were given by the medical professional at the jail. But we know about Kane. We know about Kane because her family refuses to let us forget. But there are so many others who have been in those restraints and who have ultimately died that we don't know about, which is why we started a project at Loyola to start documenting deaths behind bars. There was no list. No one could tell us which facility had people dying, what they were dying of. And because there was no list, each family felt isolated. They felt like their child was the only one. But once they started talking with one another, once we started collecting information, they realized that it wasn't just one incident, that there were, in fact, hundreds and over 1,000. So our project does this directly in Louisiana, and we work with others across the country to figure out who is dying behind bars and why. What we've seen in Louisiana is from 2015 to 2023, we have seen an increasing rate of death. We see that these are just the preventable causes of death, namely drugs, suicide, and violence. And when we analyze this data, we see that the drug-related deaths are spiking. Jails have one core responsibility, right? Secure perimeter. You want to keep the bad things out and keep the people in. That is the core job. And so the amount of people who are dying behind bars of preventable causes helps us understand how they may be failing in that core obligation. And all of that matters because these are the people who have died in the New Orleans jail. That's Jaquin on the left, he was 15 years old. At the bottom is William, who was a Coast Guard officer and a hero to many 20 years ago at Hurricane Katrina. Kane Maselli, Kentrell Hurst, Ryan Thomas, Tracy Barquette, all of them died. I also want to remind you, though, that solitary confinement, these are 3 different pictures, very different pictures of what they look like over time. And so what this helps us understand is that these spaces are, in fact, quite rigid. Changing them requires a variety of approaches, requires attention and intention. Part of that is about making them more transparent. It's about understanding what we do to one another. This is a quote from Dr. King in his letter from a Birmingham jail, and what he wrote is that it must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. And the part is, y'all have such an incredible opportunity to put meaning behind the words of Dr. King. On this top picture is where people have taken toothbrushes and carved holes in the wall and put it there because they recognized that they were still human, that they needed a sanitary place to put their toothbrushes. The bottom is the use of toothpaste on the underside bunk to create a calendar. And the reason why this is so important is because they found ways to reaffirm humanity, their own humanity, even in the hardest of spaces. And we should be able to see that part of this work as well. So a couple of things that folks can do. First is you can talk to people behind bars. We lock up an enormous amount of people. They intimately know what the problems are and might even have some solutions. The other is to recognize that courts are not the only places where these spaces are contested or challenged, but in fact, long after the case is over, oversight is still required and would be community-based in order to be sustainable. Third, visiting with others. So that top left picture is John Lewis when he was arrested in 1960. And back then, media could go and do cell-side interviews. They could even go and take pictures. Last is thinking about the ways in which you can facilitate space for storytelling. Hosting CLEs, supporting efforts of plaintiffs to attend and participate in their civil rights litigation. All of these are options. I want to thank you so much for looking and visiting with me to these spaces. And I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Salas.
One way to introduce Mr. Salas is at age 15. You'll see in a minute his exiting, but he entered prison at that early age.
For me, it's pretty strange to watch this slide because of the moment that I see those pictures, especially of the bars and the cells and of the food, my body reacts to them subconsciously. I can smell the sterileness of the air. I can feel the pain and struggle of dealing with that every single day for 27 years. And I remember what it feels like to be that in that kind of environment. When I see...
Yeah, it's not very loud at the moment. Can it be?
Would you like me to come up here to the podium? Would that be
Whatever's
easier?
good. Oh, it just.
Speak louder.
I think they just turned up the mic.
Okay.
Wherever-
So, okay. You have to remember that all this is very new to me. I've been out of prison for a little under 2 years. So, technology I got a lot to catch up on technology. But as I was saying, is that watching these slides, it's very real to me. I can feel the emotion of living in a place like that for 27 years. I recognize those places that I was forced to live because they were my home. I had no choice. And living in that environment, being wrongfully convicted, and not having a voice to kind of change that at that moment, they're real to me. Seeing the food, the first time I seen that food, and even now, my stomach immediately hurts. That is food that made me sick constantly. Her speaking about the healthcare and the struggles that you face, I remember what it felt like to feel like you were going to die of a cold or you couldn't breathe, and declaring a medical emergency, and nothing changed. Coming 3 or 4 days later that you survived that, and them telling you, well, we don't consider it a medical emergency, so we're going to infract you for that. And now you're getting sanctioned for that and even possibly taken to the hole. And this kind of environment that I lived in, they punished you for the normal things that you would feel. When I was sick a couple times, I got to a point where I felt that I was going to die. I'm not a doctor, I can't diagnose myself, but that's what it felt like. And to cry out for help, instead of getting any kind of sympathy, I got the opposite. Some of the medical staff weren't even there. They had to be called in and would arrive 2 or 3 days later. I had an individual that I knew for 20 plus years. We called him Truck. He was a pretty heavy-set dude, pretty big. He complained of having chest pains. And they sent him over there. He waited for 2 hours for the doctor to drive over there from wherever she was at. And they told him that it was indigestion and sent him right back. He died an hour later of a heart attack. I had another friend that I knew was clearly in pain and suffering, sweating profusely, was almost incoherent. Couldn't even barely walk, but they forced him to walk to the infirmary, which was about 200 yards away. Sent him back, saying the same thing, it was indigestion. He was starting to scream after that. About an hour later, it was a pregnancy that had ruptured. And they had to call the actual people within the town to come in, not the medical staff of the prison. They had to call an actual ambulance to take him. Came back about 2 months later and explained to me how terrible it was. But this was the level of health care that we had in that place. And not to mention that, but the food that they fed us. It made me sick almost every time that I ate it. Ramen noodles became an important aspect of survival in that place. And those are not very healthy either. But that's the only thing that wouldn't make me sick. Those things that I ate for 27 years still affect me to this day. They still affect me here and eating what you guys eat that is real simple to you. I can't eat certain things because my body's just not used to it. And I'll pay for it or it'll make me sick. And I remember one time when I was working inside the kitchen. And I remember seeing this box of, we used to call it mystery meat because we didn't know what it was. And on the box, in a clear label, it said, not for human consumption. I seen another box, and it was kind of some kind of weird juice or powder that they gave us. I never drank it. I was always suspicious of it. And on the box, when I went into the work, and on the box it said, known to cause cancer in laboratory animals. And this is the stuff that they were feeding and giving us every single day. And what came of that was the sickness that followed. She spoke about isolation, Because I was a juvenile, I was declined I was tried as an adult. After 3 months of being in the juvenile, I was transferred to an adult jail, and I was housed in isolation because the prison was concerned that I'd be preyed upon by the adults. Rightly so. I was 100 pounds, 5 foot nothing. And so they stuck me in isolation. For the first couple years of my sentence, I was in isolation. And then after that, I spent about 9.5 years almost straight. So I experienced what it feels like to not see the sun for nearly a decade, to not feel the wind on your face, to see like the days almost bleed together where like it's just one long day because nothing changed. But what came to me in this moment, and what really, when I think about it, and I struggle with these 2 moments while I was in there, is one of them was watching the effects that it had on everybody. Because when you're in there, you don't really see it until you actually get out. Then you realize how much you've lost and how you lose ability to socialize with others. But there was an individual that they brought in, had already been in there for over a year, housed with a couple other inmates. And he was clearly an extrovert. You know, he's tried to speak to everybody, but you can't speak while you're in isolation. They punish you for that. If they catch you sign language, or they catch you even, nodding at somebody, they consider it a threat to security. They come in and strip your cell. They punish you very harshly in that place. So everybody is silent. He's new to this, so he didn't know that. So he kept speaking out loud and yelling, but nobody would speak to him. Within about 2 months, he began to deteriorate. And I knew that he wasn't going to survive. You can always tell if that person next to you is going to survive that isolation. They're going to lose it within the first 6 months. If you make it past that 6 months, there's a good chance you're going to make it, or at least make it for maybe another year or 2. Within about 2 months, he started falling apart, swinging and screaming at things that weren't there, smearing feces on himself, throwing them on the guards. And then he just became just yelling and screaming at nothing that was there. And I remember I was living next to him, and it began to drive all the other inmates crazy because they couldn't sleep. He was doing it for hours on end, nonstop. And what everybody did in that situation, which was, it really, I thought at that moment, where am I at? The humanity had been gone in that moment, because everybody, because they couldn't sleep, he was driving everybody almost to the point of madness. They all decided that we had to get this person out of here. So with the collective voice, they all started telling him to kill himself. Kill yourself. Kill yourself. For nearly 2 days straight, it didn't stop. The 2 individuals that were next to him, was on top and one was below, and began to bang on his wall, and they took shifts. Because the only way that anybody in that place could get to sleep or have any kind of peace or not go insane themselves was to get rid of this person that couldn't be quiet. And I remember them yelling at me, because I was in the cell next to him, to do the same thing. And I wouldn't. I refused. In doing that, I was putting myself at risk. This is prison. And so, but I refused. I wasn't going to do it. And as this chaos went on for 2 or 3 days, he went silent. And I knew at then that he either killed himself or he attempted suicide, but he wasn't talking anymore. The banging didn't affect him in any kind of way. He wasn't yelling back. And I remember the guard passing by and yelling at him, "Turn around and cuff up." I knew then there was something going on. "Turn around and cuff up," they said twice. He didn't respond, ended up leaving. Came back fully suited, geared in for an cell extraction. And because he's not cuffing up, their security requirements require them that they have to be suited in and that they go in on him. Yelled at him a couple more times and then began to gas him with OC spray. All these cells are connected, ventilation. So when they started gassing him, they started gassing all of us. I was dying next to it. It affects me in a weird way, more so than others. And they kept hitting him and hitting him. He was already out. He was already on the floor. And then they have these shock shields that they come in. They hit him and it makes this loud noise. Bam, bam. And they get people to submit that way. But he was already out. They racked the door, ran in on him, dragged him out on the gurney. There's clearly blood everywhere. That moment for me is a moment that I will remember for the rest of my life. I remember his screams. He was screaming for his mother. But the way that he was screaming was almost like a primordial scream, like someone's getting killed. It was a scream that I've never heard before. And I feel guilty about that moment, because I think back on that moment, I think maybe I could have stood up for him. Maybe I could have said something. But the most horrible part about that is there's a part of me that felt relief that he was gone, because I could sleep And in that moment, I maintained a little bit of my humanity. And there was another moment that hit me really hard because I spent, like I said, 9.5 years in isolation. My dad had come to see me, and it's behind glass. They get 3 hours to see you. And he says to me, or he doesn't say anything to me. He comes with my sister, and he won't even stare at me. So I'm trying to talk to him, I'm trying to make him laugh, but he won't look at me. And I remember feeling like I had disappointed him somehow, that I did something wrong. And then the visit was over, and he still would not look at me, and he walked away. 2 days later, when I was able to finally make a call to my sister, because you only get a certain period of time out, she says, you know why Dad wouldn't look at you, right? I said, was he mad at me? She said, have you seen the way you look? So in isolation, they don't have mirrors in isolation. I didn't see my face or what I looked like for 9.5 years. When I shaved, I had to shave like this by feel. That's all I was allowed, and I was done in a controlled environment in another cell, which is a shower. My sister says that you look horrible. Your skin's not even a normal color. Your cheeks are sucked in. She goes, how much do you weigh? And at that moment, I looked at myself, and I was probably bound to maybe 120 or 130. And it's because in there they don't feed you enough. I didn't have to do a single thing. And I just want people to understand, mind you, I was in there for something I didn't do. The things that I was facing was unjust. But this is just a small stories of 27 years of horror that I can tell you on. And I'm not even got to the violent parts of everything, or the mental issues that people were doing or going on in there. But these are the things that stay with me to this moment. When I hug my father, my family, I shake. And they ask me, well, why do you shake? I don't know. I can't tell them. It's a product of that isolation. My privacy bubble was huge. When someone got close to me, I cowered away. I couldn't read people's social cues, so they thought I was weird once I was released from that place. I had to warn people when I got around them. When I moved into a new roommate or a cellmate, I explained to them, look, this is what I've been through. Don't take it the wrong way. I'm learning how to be social again. And even now, getting out of prison and going home and seeing my father, who's still there, who has loved me through it all, who suffered with me and struggled with me. The first month that I was out, the food was so good, but I couldn't stomach it. I got sick over and over again. And then he says to me after a month, he says, are you all right? I said, yeah, what do you mean? He goes, well, you don't speak. You don't say nothing. You're quiet. I can't read you. I didn't even realize the effects that had on me. Not only the isolation, but just the prison environment. But my family could see it. They felt and looked at me as a stranger, and I felt odd around them. And that is something I had to learn how to do. And that is something I still would deal with today. In prison, they have these lines, red lines everywhere. Everything's out of bounds. Everything's a one-way walk. You stop, they yell at you, or they take you to the hole. I see those red lines, and I immediately go back to that. I even asked my sister one time, hey, can I head over there? And she looks at me strange. Why do you say that? I said, the red line. She was confused by it. I had to explain to her. What I want to kind of put out there is the policies that are created by the legislator, the rules and case laws that are governed by the courts and all that. They affect individuals in a personal way, whether they're in prison justly or unjustly. I'm a product of those decisions and those policies, even the ones that you think are for the benefit of it. I know in Washington they decided, well, we're going to provide nutritious meals to the prisoners. That looks good on paper. But what the prison did to implement that was take certain things away and just try to calorie count everything. And we suffered even more for that, to the point that the inmates decided that they're not going to eat no more. They even began to take away certain meals and give us boxed lunches and say, well, these calories is what you need. And we suffered for that. So think about the choices that you make in depth. I encourage you guys to visit those places. Just like he said, to be close to them so you can understand even the good things that you have, how they're implemented. Because the prison, when it comes to them, they're going to do what they can for the security first, and then they're going to try to enact it, but they do it in a faulty way, And I'm a product of that, good or bad. And I was there unjustly, and there's individuals that are still there, And like I said, getting out, I'm still reluctant to go to the doctor. My dad says, you got to go, you got to get checked. No, Dad, I'm all right. I had to fight with myself to just go, even for the normal thing. I had a toothache. For 6 years in prison, my filler fell out. And I suffered through that because they would break your teeth, they'd pull the wrong tooth, or they wouldn't call you out. And even when I got out, I was in so much pain. My dad had to force me to go. And so just think about that, and what kind of effects that has on individuals, because they are people. I'm a person, I stand here today, 27 years, and I survived all that. And so I just want you guys to really think about the choices that you make. So.
Put the picture of the exit
Oh yeah,
on the
my
screen.
day of freedom.
And then send it to Director Ramish.
That was a beautiful moment, by the way.
There, that's a picture to hang into some.
I had to take a deep breath. The reason was,
Microphone again, I think.
the last time I appeared before this very prestigious Ninth Circuit several years ago, I was about 80% intimidated. Not 100% because I was from the 10th. Now I'm from the 7th district. I'm still only 80%.
There. Go for it's going.
There we go. All right. I got my job in the worst possible way. Most of you know him. My predecessor, the executive director of Colorado at the time, was assassinated. And he was assassinated, ironically, by a white supremacist, mentally ill inmate who had spent 7 years in solitary confinement and then was released directly into the community. Give me a quick picture of at least the state system. 77% are addicted to drug, alcohol, or both. 34% are of mental health issues. Over 14% are seriously mentally ill, and I mean off the planet, seriously mentally ill. The Bureau statistics that I could find for those with mental health issues found anywhere from 19 to 40%. But the reason I say this is every prison in the United States is the largest mental health institution nationally. The Supermax prison, it's now called restrictive housing. And the reason it's called restrictive housing, I had the opportunity to co-chair an American Corrections Association meeting a couple years ago. We were redoing the policies on segregation, and it became very apparent that segregation was called a lot of different things, but wasn't being called segregation. You had your segregation, you had administrative segregation, you had protective custody, you had suicide watch. So restrictive housing, the definition is anyone that's in custody for 23 hours or 22 hours or more per day. Now, when you hear someone testify about that, that's a misstatement. It's 23 hours a day, Monday through Friday, and on weekends, nobody gets out anywhere. What got me interested in solitary reform, and I'll call it RH reform now, when I oversaw corrections in Wisconsin, the warden at a maximum security prison came to me and said, my RH beds are completely full most of the time. He had about 100 of them. And he said, mainly with those with mental health. And so our executive team got together with the warden, with the clinicians, with the correctional officers. I stood before them and I said, here's what you're going to do. You're going to develop a program to get those people out of RH gave them a time period, and said, by the way, I don't have any money to give to you to do it. They formed behavioral health units that became the quietest units in that prison. And I won't get into details on what occurred in those units, except that it was good programming. By the time I left, a gentleman who had been in RH for over 20 years was now in general population and doing quite well. You know, people that aren't involved in corrections always would come to me and say, I want to see a supermax. My response would be, why? You aren't going to see anything. You're going to hear some things you don't want to hear. You're going to smell some things you don't want to smell. You're going to have people trying to throw body fluids on you. And the only thing that you could see, you aren't allowed to because it's just too atrocious to watch. What you do see, it's always policy to take 2 correctional officers. When you take an offender somewhere within the facility, leg chains, handcuffs, belly chains, do the inmate shuffle. And I call it the inmate shuffle because you can't walk correctly. There's a Colorado segregation cell, RH cell. Taking a shower this morning, I noticed that the bathroom and shower in the hotel here was probably a little bit bigger than a RH cell. To give you a good idea of the dimension, I always use it, it's about the size of a parking space. I had the opportunity to talk to one gentleman, Albert Woodfox. He holds the world's record, I believe, in solitary confinement. He spent over 40 years in Angola in RH. He said he had developed some tricks that kept his mind straight, but every time we got finally released from prison, he's deceased now, but he said when he was even in a community where he knew the community, he got lost because he had no depth perception. He couldn't see things that were outside of that parking space. There used to not be a lot of data about the use or overuse of solitary confinement. There's a lot of data now. Over half of the suicides, more than half, occur for those that are in RH. And it's not just RH. A recent study has been done that shows that a person that has spent time in RH and gets released to the community, within 1 year, they're 78% more likely to commit suicide, 54% more likely to die by homicide. A study by a noted psychiatrist said that time in solitary RH causes either reoccurrence of pre-existing mental illness or manufactures mental illness. We began our reforms for administrative segregation in July 2014. We did some reforms earlier, but administrative segregation, at the time, and nationally this still exists, you do your disciplinary RH for a violation. When that's done, they hold a hearing and they determine one of two things. You're either too dangerous to be in general population, we all get that, or the caveat, or if you're too disruptive to the efficient running of an institution. That can be just about anybody on any given day. The point is that that policy, you can put someone in for any reason. And once they're in, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Because most states, including Colorado, had what they called a level system. Level system, there can be 3, 4, 5, whatever. You have to earn your way out, and I hate that term. People would say if you earn your way in, you got to earn your way out. Those with mental health issues, trust me, they can't earn their way out. But if you have make it through level 1 and have a bad day in level 2, you go back to level 1. If you have a bad day in level 4, you go back to level 1. And that's how 1 month turns into 1 year, turns into 5 years, turns into 20 years, turns into 40 years. what we did was we started a residential treatment program. The whole purpose of that program was to determine why someone was ending up in RH to begin with, and then finding a cure to stop that activity. It was very successful. We were able to pass legislation with working with the governor, the legislature, and the ACLU to legislatively ban placing those that are seriously mentally ill into RH. We had about 250 inmates that refused to come out. At the time, we had a population, when I got there, of about 500. Those 250, most of them with mental health problems, we got them out in 3 ways. First of all, thought it would be way too ironic to physically remove someone that we had physically put in there to begin with. So what we did, at-the-door therapy, and ask any clinician, at-the-door therapy, offenders don't want another offender to hear what they have to say next door, so it's hard. But it was the only therapy we could give them because they wouldn't come out. We used what my staff called incentives. I called them bribes, gave them additional items, canteen items, additional privileges. That got a number out. This gentleman, some came out because we had a very strong therapy dog program. I talked to one gentleman that had been in for 20 years. When I asked why he had been in RH for 20 years, I was told he threatened to kill a correctional officer. I said, did he? No. How has he been doing for those 20 years? Well, he can't get through the level system. I said, don't you think you ought to let him out? The dogs brought him out. When I asked him why, he said it was the only stable thing he had when he was growing up. San Carlos Correctional Facility is a facility, a prison, that houses those that are seriously mentally ill. There was about a 2-year waiting list to get in that facility. Good idea. The bad thing was that they had not doing correct programming, and they had RH cells there. Some seriously mentally ill were there for years. So when I toured it for the first time, I saw an offender in RH smearing feces on the wall, and a clinician nonchalantly walking by. And I said, do you do that every day? Yeah. All day? Pretty much. Does he do it when you let him out? No. What the hell? Let him out. So I banned it. A really good sergeant that worked there emailed my deputy and said, you're going to get someone killed. 6 months later, I was taking a professor from Stanford a tour through there. That same sergeant was working unsolicited. The professor said, so, with these reforms, have incidences dropped? Sergeant kind of smiled and said, yeah. How much? Over 80%. And those are the results that you see. Violence down, problems down. When those things are down, people are up. It was a miracle. Where it used to be 2 officers taking 1 person's programming, now groups of 10 to 12 escorted going to programming. We made what was called de-escalation cells. Very cheap to put together. Soft colors, comfortable chair, blackboard on the wall, chalk, some de-escalation materials like stress balls, piped in noise, wind, waves, soothing. As you can see, murals, comfortable colors. And I went through there one time, there was a gentleman using it. It's open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, unlocked. And a week later at a different time, was walking through, and that same gentleman was there, and I thought, bureaucracy's caught up again. They're using it as a RH cell. Took the warden aside after the tour, asked him about it, he said, oh no. He uses it 5 to 7 times a day. That's 5 to 7 times a day a person's not blowing up on somebody. It was so popular that now all the prisons have them. That's our former supermax. Anybody killing each other? They're talking. They're having programming. Our staff is interacting with them instead of what I call the steel door solution, which is you throw someone in RH, slam the door shut, and walk away. The results are tremendous. Picture a former supermax where you now walk down the hallway and you see an offender out in the hallway ironing his pants. You see artwork on the wall. You see employers coming in to interview pre-release. The results are absolutely amazing. And the fine lies, that's what you get. One vacant supermax prison and one repurposed supermax prison, and the total amount you can now spend in restrictive housing in Colorado, unless they change it since I left in 2019, is 15 days. And at the time I left, no one had spent a total of 15 days in there because they could, by just doing a few things, I won't say earn their way out, but they got out. Thank you.
So last but not least, I'm going to shift to release. And again, just wanted to thank Judge Thomas and the committee for putting this together. It's a deep, deep honor to be here to be speaking to you as a physician. I've been asked to talk about release and its implications for the judicial system. And I'll couch my comments on our team's research, my own practice, collective experience, probably of taking care of more than 10,000 patients released from correctional facilities in the last 20 years in a national network of primary care programs called the Transitions Clinic Network. In medicine, we often look to individual and family fixes for poor health, but I think it's been critically important to take a lens to really interrogate the systems, the healthcare systems in the community and the carceral systems, how they impact health and how they have created outsized problems, barriers, and constraints for our population health and population safety. And so, typical as a doctor, I'm going to start with a patient story. This is Mark. He's a sketch of a person that I've known for 15 years. He's 55, and he has an addiction, a history of opioid use disorder that dated back to his 20s. He also has hepatitis C and hypertension and was just diagnosed with cancer. He's been in and out of prison for his whole life, almost 40 years, and the most consistent form of healthcare he's had was when he was behind bars. And this says something, just to start, about how deficient our healthcare system is as a nation when his access to healthcare is mostly behind bars. In fact, the data show that among those that move through prisons and jails, 40% are newly diagnosed with a chronic health condition while they're behind bars. And this, of course, includes substance use disorder, mental health conditions, but it also includes physical health conditions like hypertension, like cancer, like hepatitis C, what Mark had. You all have already heard a lot about the carceral healthcare system this afternoon, and I want to add, as a doctor, a few more points here just to really kind of lay into this. So current law mandates that healthcare is provided at a certain level in carceral systems, but healthcare access is limited by institutional policies. And these pictures all come from permission from the California Department of Corrections. And I just want you to turn your attention to that pink slip in the picture. It's a kite. Patients have to fill it out when they have a complaint, an urgent care issue. Mr. Salas referred to this to see a physician. In California, this was the case at the time. This is before Plata v. Davis, but it continues in many other states, where the first person that evaluates the kite is a correctional officer. And if the correctional officer deems there's medical necessity, then it's a nurse, and then it's a physician. So it's not like in the community where you can roll up, and if worst case scenario, you can go to the emergency department and see a physician. There are multiple institutional barriers just to getting your healthcare needs addressed. The other thing, of course, is co-payments. As Professor Armstrong alluded, in Connecticut, it's $3 to see a physician. That's equivalent to 4 days worth of work, so a little bit better than in Louisiana. But these aren't the only healthcare costs that are levied by the system. Patients in certain states in Nevada have to pay $50 for a man-down fee. So if they're found down in cell and need emergency services, they're paid $50 and charged for that. The quality of healthcare is variable and unmeasured in most correctional systems, and perhaps, again, the best example of this is for the treatment of addiction and opioid use disorder. So this is a picture of a patient that's making a line to get his daily dose of methadone. Opioid use disorder is highly prevalent in correctional systems given the criminalization of drug use. And in a national survey, 40% of individuals that have used heroin this past year have spent time in a prison or jail in this year. So it's naturally the place that we should be treating addiction. There are 3 FDA-approved medications that are highly effective at reducing harms of opioid use disorder. This includes methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. But these medications, of course, are not universally available in all correctional facilities. A recent study showed that fewer than half, so about 43%, have these medications for some of their individuals that have addiction, opioid use disorder, in jails. And only 12% are actually screening people for opioid use disorder and then offering all 3 medications. This is in spite of strong federal guidance through the SUPPORT Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, underscoring the importance of having these medications in correctional facilities to address the opioid crisis. Now, why is this the case? This is in part because most correctional systems, security oversees healthcare, not physicians, and so they're the ones that are making the decisions about whether these medications are available and which ones are available. And so what happens for patients like my patient Mark is that if you're on methadone and you're incarcerated, you're arrested in a jail that happens to not have the medications, then you have to go to detox. You have to, of course, stop the medication. It's not available. And this is a bone-crushing, painful experience. Some of my patients have described it worse than labor without medications. And so for people who have addictions that spend time cycling in and out of these healthcare systems, they're of course resistant to trying these 3 medications that are highly effective. This photo is a patient with cancer. People are aging behind bars given the extraordinarily long sentences. And we see the rates of chronic health conditions increasing in this population. Cancer is now the leading cause of death in prisons. I recently saw another patient who was incarcerated for 10 years, and during his incarceration, he was diagnosed with a brain lymphoma. He was scared out of his mind. This is the first time he's ever received any worrisome health condition diagnosis behind bars. And he was introduced to the care team, prepared for his first chemotherapy, and he was shackled at his outside cancer center hospital while receiving intrathecal chemotherapy. And this is a needle in your back that's piercing the spinal cord. And of course, this was a horrifying experience for the patient. He refused to continue treatment even after release and ended up dying from his cancer. And the point that I want to make here is that even healthcare delivery in carceral systems is punitive. And you have to start imagining how patients that pass through the correctional system out into the community and back again, how it is that they trust providers like myself, that health system at large. And then, of course, the vast majority of people come home into the community. Carceral systems care is largely siloed from community health systems. We never learn about this in medical school. There isn't a training. Our electronic health records are not linked. And so when a person comes home from a correctional facility, it doesn't matter if they've served a 30-day sentence or a 40-year sentence, they usually have a short supply of medication, if they're lucky, 30 days, a piece of paper that describes their medical history, and they have to find their own physician, mental health provider, substance use provider. We recently had a patient that had to find his own dialysis chair, and y'all all know how hard it is to get a primary care patient, and imagine being patients just coming home from the correctional system. In many patients, they're released without their identification. So how do you get an appointment without an ID? Many don't have insurance or have to reactivate their insurance. And so my patient, Mark, again, faced these similar barriers coming home. He had this new diagnosis of cancer, but had never had to navigate the healthcare system. Again, all his access of healthcare was behind bars and didn't know how to go about this. And because the program that I work in, Transitions Clinic, his first interaction was with a community health worker, a peer, a woman who'd been incarcerated, Manya, who knew what it was like to be incarcerated and started working to rebuild trust. And instead of counting on Mark to engage the healthcare system, she went into the halfway houses and met him, helped him get his ID, get Medicaid turned on, expedite primary care. And so when we saw each other in clinic for the first time, he could talk comfortably about his experience having been incarcerated, his distrust. He was adamant about not starting any medications for opioid use disorder, given his experience having been in prison and in jail, not having methadone and being detoxed. But he was interested in being treated for hepatitis C, and so we started treatment. Mark was on parole in Connecticut through the state system, and when he relapsed on opioids, he was violated, returned back to prison. And as his doctor, this is incredibly frustrating. Relapse is an expected part of addiction. It's a relapsing and remitting condition. Mark went back in, released again, and we had to start the process all over again. Getting ID, getting him back on Medicaid, restarting his treatment, figuring out where his hepatitis C is again, trying to engage him in again for the next time on starting up medications for opioid use disorder. Each time he'd aged, his diseases had progressed, and there were more discontinuities in his care. And this isn't unique to this patient. The only exception here in Mark's story is that he had a primary care doctor. Millions move in and out of these two healthcare systems that aren't linked, which then, of course, create additional health harms over the life course and across our population. And you can see it most concretely in this opioid overdose epidemic that we have. Two recent studies that came out in the Journal of American Medicine Association have found that anywhere from 20 to 40% of all overdoses in a county and then in Connecticut are among those just released from jail. So it's our carceral systems and this release in and out that are driving the epidemic. I'll say one quick word here about halfway houses and transitional housing. Many individuals, including in many states, including in Connecticut, people return home and are released to halfway houses, which are still overseen by the carceral system. They are spaces where people are housed, there's programming, and in certain jurisdictions, it's meant to help people reintegrate back into the community. But even in these systems, there are significant barriers to returning home and reintegrating. And so there's restrictions on obtaining state benefits. This includes SNAP, getting disability on, so that once you leave the transitional house, you actually have the income to then get into another form of housing. The American Disabilities Act, as it turns out, doesn't pertain to halfway houses. So we had a patient that was just released in a wheelchair, and she was released to a halfway house without a wheelchair ramp and had to army crawl up the stairs through the bathroom. And these are just conditions that are not protected, safeguarded in halfway houses. And then there are no standard housing protections, in spite of the fact that individuals have to pay some sort of rent for living there, such as those that are applied to renters. So individuals have problems securing housing, heating, and getting their windows fixed for the winter. And so not surprisingly, in this overall context, many studies over and over have shown that actually health worsens. If you think it's bad behind bars, it's actually worse when people return home to the community health systems that we're also in charge of. That's taxpayer money driven. 40% of individuals that were on a medication when they were incarcerated actually continue on that treatment into the community. So this is on it, and then they stop when they come home. And we see a worsening of other chronic health conditions. Those that have been studied include HIV, hypertension, and cancer, a high risk of hospitalizations, most of which are preventable with engagement in primary care, and a high risk of death. So what do I hope that you're going to take away from this? One is that we have, because of the last 50 years of mass incarceration, have a system in place where the majority of individuals that are incarcerated have a chronic health condition that includes addiction, which is treatable with connection to care. But because we have the system that where people cycle in and out, there's huge disruptions and worsening of care. release is an incredibly, is a period that's very risky and causes a worsening of health conditions at high cost to the health system and to community health and to community safety. And I would say that parole and probation stipulations may often conflict with current medical recommendations on the treatment of addiction. I know, again, that the Ninth Circuit and the probation, you guys are at the fore of making sure that individuals that are in your care and custody actually have the availability of 3 medications and understand that addiction is a relapsing and remitting condition. But it's one that, again, in states all over the country, this is still contested. And that community supervision settings, lastly, are not designed to support people with chronic conditions or engagement with the community health system. And so if there's one thing to take away is that decisions at sentencing have a long effect on people's physical and mental health that extends through incarceration and then way in after release. Repeated exposure to the system has implications for our community's health. And I think to do better, the kind of key thing that I think you're getting from all of us is to understand kind of the people before you at sentencing, ask questions about their health, ask questions about where they've come from, and understand the context of the systems, both in the carceral system and the community health system, that are creating the circumstances that are actually harming their health.
So, thank you. And our clock is ticking or has ticked in some way. And so I wanted to just briefly read a few of the questions that we won't have time to answer collectively, but can individually, I do want to flag a couple quick answers to a couple of them, and mostly per the hope and what can we do. All of this is the Medical Legal Partnership, Abby Gluck at Yale and you at the medical school, a bunch of us in coalition professions are working together to try to figure out how to make sustaining change in things that have become normal, but which I think you've just seen are radically abnormal as human behavior. To imagine none of us could move for the next 40 hours from exactly where you are. It's the only way I know how to at least glimpse the idea of the bizarreness of some of the behavior. So one question in this pod is, are there studies on prison staff, guards, mental health? Yes, there are many. All of us can provide you with sites. It's really bad for the people who work there, and then it's bad for the communities. And the issue of reframing this as a general public health issue. Is there truth that when defendants tell judges they don't have access to addiction meds, what can judges do to help them get it? Get doctors and testimony in sentencing transcripts and in supervised release proceedings to try to understand. Ask BOP in the federal system and other systems, because people come in and out of state federal, about how you can engage and what is being done to expand this whole discussion. How does it apply to immigration detention facilities? This is the tip. These are questions that are the tip of the iceberg. I think there are more already collected at the desk. And I want to give 30, do any of you want to add in a minute more in response to these?
Yeah. I don't know if this is on.
Yes.
If you can hear me, the question about the effect on correctional officers, very quickly in these supermaxes, can you imagine working 8 to 12 hours a day there, and they're trying to throw body fluids on you, a lot of self-harm, suicides, attacks, and then you go home and your partner says, "How was your day, dear?" It sucked. Correctional officers have, I believe, the highest rate of suicide, drug and alcohol addiction, domestic abuse, divorce. It's an incredibly stressful job, and the pay is not the best, which causes all kinds of different other problems. But, and staffing nationally now, the vacancies, I was in one maximum security prison last year, 75% vacancy of correctional officers. So you know who's running the show there. And then this is a national crisis, as is the drug use.
There's a lot to fix, and there's a lot in this room of capacity to make dents, if not to fix it all. So we want to thank you for welcoming this program, and would be happy to talk informally after it. Judge Thomas.
I just want to take a minute to thank each of our panelists for what I think has been an extremely important presentation, really an extremely important education for those of us in this room. Judith, Andrea, Rick, Emily, thank you each for being here. And Mr. Salas, to you in particular, thank you so much for being here today and this week to share your experience with us. I think that you've helped us all to see things that too often remain unseen in our world. It was a privilege for us to hear your words this afternoon. So thank you very much for being here.